because really what we have seen during this pandemic is science happening in real time.
What's up, you scholars of enlightenment? The COVID-19 pandemic has been raging for 2 years now, more or less. And in that time, we've discovered an incredible amount about the microscopic virus that has caused so much significant human suffering, economic damage, and political unrest. However, we've also learned that there are many who seek to speak about the virus without the necessary logic, facts, and evidence to support their proclamations. In short, we've had a kind of secondary parallel pandemic of falsehoods, half-truths, and misinformation driven by financial and social media incentives, truly held contrarian beliefs, and a distrust of our medical and scientific institutions and personnel. And one person who's been fighting to get his pants on as fast as possible before misinformation goes around the world 5 times is today's fantastic special guest, Dr. Dan Wilson. So Dr. Wilson, welcome to the channel.
Hi, Sam. Thanks so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you very much for taking the time. I've seen that you're a very, very busy man. So Dr. Wilson earned his PhD in molecular biology from Carnegie Mellon University, and his PhD research focused on how cells build ribosomes, the nanomachine cells use to produce proteins, including viral proteins. He also has an excellent and vastly underappreciated YouTube channel, DebunkDaFunk, where he challenges pseudoscience, anti-science, and bad science. And I urge you to go and check it out. All the links will be in the description. So, Dan, first up, why do you do this? Why is it so vital that we tackle COVID misinformation? Why have you made this your mission?
Yeah, so I've always been really passionate about science communication. And one of the reasons I'm passionate about it is because I used to myself believe in conspiracy theories. And, you know, I kind of came out of that rabbit hole and went on my scientific career journey thanks to some really good communicators in science. And, you know, science still has a lot of big shortcomings when it comes to communication. And these gaps in science communication can often get filled by misinformation and conspiracy theories. And that obviously can, and as we have seen, results in a lot of harm and can even impede science when our legislators, for example, fall for that stuff. So science has to do better in communication. It can do better. And I just wanted to contribute what I can, the best way that I can to that cause. And my way of doing that is making videos in my spare time.
And I think I want to come on to some of those ways we could possibly do better in a little bit. But I think right up front, you make a really good point for people watching, is that this isn't about calling people stupid. It's not about saying, you know, you're an idiot, you're not doing the right things. It's very easy to listen to a flashy salesman or someone who has great rhetoric and be misled on a complicated subject, isn't it? It's not about just throwing shade at people and saying, well, you're not doing the right things or think you're wrong thinking.
Yeah, right. My goal is not to dunk on people. And, you know, don't get me wrong. I do that sometimes.
we all do it sometimes.
You know, I'm not perfect. I don't like always practice this goal that I have of communicating passionately, compassionately with the people who I think are misled.
Yeah.
But that is my goal. I do try my best to do that because that's really how you change minds, is by getting people to trust you and talking with them, having real conversations, not just, you know, tweeting 150 characters at them saying, you're stupid, get dunked on, you know.
Yeah, it's very easy to do, but as you said, it's probably not the most productive thing if we're trying to change minds. So what has been the reaction to your work on this? Because I've watched a lot of your videos, and they're very good, very well researched, excellent content. But some of the comment sections, I have to admit, there's some quite aggressive characters down in there. I think when I contacted you about this, you said sometimes you don't even want to go into those comment sections. So what has the reaction been to your work, sort of debunking some of these characters who are putting out COVID misinformation?
Yeah, I think it's been mostly positive. I think that, as you said, my comment sections are usually a hellscape of just uh, people
People
who
who
don't like me.
completely agree, or people who think you're like the Antichrist, basically.
Right, right. Yeah. So a lot of people who contact me directly, all my contact information is in all of my videos.
Mm,
Um, a lot of people, most of the people who contact me directly are very positive.
mm,
And I know that I have a lot of uh, trolls and detractors, hecklers in my comment sections,
mm,
more so in comment sections of videos where I tackle some bigger figures.
mm. Yeah,
For example, I made a couple of videos about Kurt Vandenbosch,
yeah,
an anti-vaxxer, who ended up making a blog post about me because he didn't like my videos,
yeah,
and then that sent a ton of people
yeah.
going to my comment sections. But yeah, mostly positive.
Because what I found with YouTube, doing science videos on YouTube, is that politically neutral science information. So if you're talking about James Webb, you're talking about black holes, you're talking about the Large Hadron Collider, whatever it might be, there doesn't tend to be that sort of political partisanship that comes in with that. But if you start talking about topics that have become politically partisan, so we start talking about ivermectin, for example,
Hmm.
or we start talking about vaccines, then that sort of political partisanship comes in, and then you
Hmm.
start to get this polarization, and that's very much a sphere that you operate in.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. And I think it kind of goes back to what I said earlier about um, these gaps in science communication being filled by
Hmm.
misinformation, which can flourish on platforms like YouTube.
Yeah,
So when people hear news pundits talking about things like ivermectin, they'll go to YouTube and
yeah,
see what are people saying about this, and they listen to their favorite long form podcasters who may or may not know what they're talking about.
yeah. That's exactly right. So I guess as we kind of start into this, your video is very well researched. You clearly take a lot of time to go and find the information. Where do you get your facts from? And why do you believe you can trust them? Because one thing that we've has become painfully aware of during this pandemic is that some people simply don't trust the scientific information that's coming out or the main scientific establishment. So where do you get your facts from, and why should people be happy with the facts that you're putting out?
Yeah, so I get my information from the scientific community, to be perfectly honest. So when you do a PhD, when you go through the process of doing scientific research, you kind of have to learn how to learn.
Mm,
You read all the papers in your field and you become an expert in that field.
mm,
Now, I haven't read all the papers in the fields of immunology and virology, and I'm not an expert in those fields, but I know how to find the experts and find what they're saying. Look at their research. What does the data say? What are they talking about in those fields? And that's kind of what you find on sites like PubMed,
mm,
where you can look at scientific journals
mm.
and you get details that you don't get from
Yeah,
news pundits and sound
yeah.
bites.
I
So,
think
yeah.
that's one of the big first things that I would say on this topic, isn't it? That when people see science, it's often already been filtered through a science communicator, through a politician, through some pundit on YouTube who wants to give it a particular spin. So if
Hmm.
you want to get the raw science, often you have to go back to the source or a scientific communicator who is less maybe financially involved, for example.
Hmm.
You're already seeing a filtered version of the science, and that gives people a wrong impression. And scientists often, I think, get a rough deal out of that because you put the science out there, and then what people do with it is a kind of it takes on a little bit of a life of its own sometimes.
Yeah, definitely. And if I could just quickly plug another
Of
podcast
course, please do.
called This Week in Virology.
Hmm.
Um, so, what I try to do is, I pay attention to people who write scientific papers or who share scientific papers written by their peers
Hmm.
and make sure that they're the experts in their field. And this podcast, This Week in Virology, is they kind of have what we call journal clubs in science in podcast form. Um, it's run by virologists and immunologists. They have guests on frequently who publish papers, and they will talk about these issues, same issues that you hear on the news, but in with much more detail and
Yeah.
clarity than I think that the news does. So if I could plug one podcast, I would say go listen to them.
And I think there's another really interesting point that you raise, and I had this realization when I started doing a PhD after undergrad, was that
Mhm.
undergrad was very much kind of learn how to answer questions, learn the
Yeah.
facts of your subject. Whereas when I moved into PhD, the first thing I realized was, as you said, learn how to think. How am I going to
Mhm.
work out something new using the scientific method from first principles? And you learn a great, I found, learn a great humility as to what you don't know about that field. And I
Mhm.
think that shines through with a lot of people who are a bit more on the misinformation side of things, that they tend to feel that they're experts in every single field, where because things are so complicated nowadays, we have so much human knowledge about different fields that it's very, very difficult to do that. So when I want to talk about COVID, when I want to talk about something that I don't know much about as a professional, I tend to go to someone else to find it. And I find that a lot of these people don't necessarily do that.
Mhm. Right. Yeah. It's for anybody who might be thinking about doing a PhD or is currently in a PhD program themselves. It's very normal to feel absolutely clueless for the first like 2, 3 years that you're doing your PhD.
Yeah.
I felt like I was among geniuses who were so much
Yeah.
smarter than me for that
Yeah.
time. But that's good. You're in an environment where you're learning a lot
Yeah.
when you feel like you're around people who are smarter than you. But
I
yeah, it just
can definitely echo that. The first year, 2 years, I was just like, I don't think I can do this. Maybe I'm not as smart as I thought I was. But
yeah,
that's part of the learning process, is, as you said, learning how to go from start to finish on a subject that is novel, that you didn't necessarily know much about.
right. And I sort of, I've even learned a lot during this pandemic where, I started my YouTube channel just before COVID really took off, actually. It was kind of a coincidence where I was coming to the last year of my PhD and I thought, I really want to scratch this science communication itch that I have.
Yeah.
And I'm like, let me just try. I've always thought about making a YouTube channel. Let me just do it. Let me just try it. And I made it and I started talking about the anti-vaxxers that I was familiar
Yeah.
with,
Yeah.
just having fun with it. Um, and then COVID took off and I was like, wow,
Right place, right time. Yeah.
I guess so,
Yeah.
yeah. But when I had to, when I was reading more and more papers about it, now that I was doing these YouTube videos, I definitely learned a lot. And, you just have to, if you think that you can listen to sound bites from the news or just one podcast episode and think you have the answers, you probably don't. You really have to do the work to read papers to really get a good understanding of what the data actually say. But of course, if you don't have time for that, listen to This Week in Virology.
Well, that's the problem, isn't it? We live in a world where there's lots of information, where there's lots of things going on, lots of topics that are difficult, like virology, for example, with this pandemic, and people tend to go to these bottleneck sources because it's convenient and
Hmm.
it's a shorthand. But if you going to someone who doesn't necessarily know what they're talking about, or is purposefully misleading, then that's a problem. We
Right.
talked about, and we mentioned up front, that there's a lot of people who simply don't trust that politicians, institutions, scientific institutions have their best interests at heart. And you talked a little bit about how we could improve science communication to maybe overcome some of those issues. What do you think we could do as science communicators to help repair that trust in the institutions? Because we said there are a lot of problems where people are putting out misinformation, or politicians take science and they twist it, and that comes back to scientists. But we also have to look at our own house and try and do better. And some of the communication during this pandemic hasn't been great. We can't claim it has been perfect. What do you think are some of the biggest things we could do to repair trust in the scientific institutions going forwards?
I think looking at this pandemic as an example, communicating uncertainty
Yes.
better
Yeah.
is a really big thing that we can improve on. Because really what we have seen during this pandemic is science happening in real time.
Mm.
Uh, Usually what happens is scientists spend months or years in lab meetings, in conferences, doing their research in their labs, and then talking about it, writing up a paper, and then publishing it. And then the media reports on those big papers,
So
right?
it
That
looks
come
like
out.
it just happens bang and it's done,
Yes,
but you don't see all of the guts under the surface that's been going on for the last few years.
right. And no one really cares about the story until it's a big
Yeah.
story published in a journal. But now with the pandemic happening, everyone wants answers right away. And so people are going to preprint journals. People are wanting answers right away. They're looking to these, um, news sources for the quick answers. And the complexity of the issue will often get lost. Um, and also, the health communicators they want to give answers. They want to try to say, okay, this is what we know right now, but they don't really communicate like we don't know much right now,
Yes.
and it could change. And one example of this was with masks early in the pandemic. So, as we all know, uh, in the beginning, the CDC was recommending that people don't wear masks when COVID first started to spread in the US in March. And that was because there, uh, it wasn't spreading widely. We wanted to keep a stockpile for healthcare professionals.
Yeah.
And uh, they said, we don't think there's a reason to recommend it right now. Um, and I thought that made sense because to me, at the beginning of this pandemic, this was looking like SARS-1, which kind of fizzled, right? It didn't turn into this.
I remember talking to an expert about this as well, and the sort of data on masks was mixed, wasn't it? Because we know that masks work if they're quote unquote used properly, but how masks would be used in the community, people wearing them under their noses, people touching their faces more, would people go out into more dangerous situations feeling that they were more protected with a mask? It wasn't clear how that would kind of weigh out in the community at the start of the pandemic with SARS-CoV-2.
Yeah, it's more mostly on that last point you made, where there was also a worry that if they recommended masks, that people would just be like, okay, I'll put on a mask and I'll
Yeah,
go about
yeah,
my daily life.
yeah,
But really, we wanted this multi-pronged approach of let's socially distance, let's be careful, let's wash our hands and wear a mask. But
yeah,
um, again, that all could have been communicated much better in the beginning.
yeah,
But then when the situation changed, when we got more data, and we saw that SARS-CoV-2 is spreading very fast, very widely, um, and uh, we realized masks are going to be really important for slowing the spread. The message changed, and that confused people.
yeah.
Right? They expected answers up front. It wasn't properly communicated that we don't really know how this is going to play out, but here's what we're recommending right now. Stand by for more information. There's an effective way to communicate that, and we had to figure out what we can do better.
I agree with that. That there's a difficult sort of dichotomy here, isn't there? Here because people, if you give people a piece of information or a piece of guidance, which is like, I'm not really sure what to do, then they might think, oh well, this person doesn't seem to know what they're talking about, I won't do anything. But at the same time, if you give very clear instructions and then those clear instructions then flip 180 or change significantly, you look like you didn't know what you were doing in the first place. But I think you're right. There's positions on that dial where we could show a little bit more humility, a little bit more level of uncertainty, and making people clear that this is the best we have now. This is the best we can do at the moment. It may change, and if it does, that's part of the scientific process. That is normal. That can happen. And we didn't necessarily get that right, as you say, on things like masks. So I think that is a very good thing to say. Maybe a little bit more humility and a little bit more expression of the uncertainty that underpins good science. Because as you say, a lot of these people who are pushing more misinformation, a hallmark and a red flag that I find with them is that they're very, very certain, and that to someone who has worked in science like myself, like yourself, it's an immediate red flag when
Right.
they seem certain about what they're saying. So I think that's a very good point to make. Before we go into some of the points of specific misinformation that you've dealt with on your channel, What would you say to someone who looks at the information that's coming out from the main scientific institutions? They're not exactly sure where things are going. We see people having third jabs over here in the UK. You know, I've had 2 jabs and a booster, or some places talking about 4th jabs like Israel. Where is the public policy taking on this? Why should we continue to trust the scientific establishments when it seems like we're never going to get our lives back to normal? What would you say to people who are struggling a little bit like that? I think some of those people who kind of take it out on your channel when they're confused about where we're going.
Yeah, I totally understand the confusion about how many doses do we need, when exactly do we go back to normal, all that stuff. But the best advice I can give is to get those 2 to 3 doses of vaccine, because there seems to be a lot of confusion about, oh, the vaccines are waning and that's why we need a 3rd dose and blah, 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 4th dose. So when companies started out doing these clinical trials, most companies chose 2 doses for their vaccine, and that's what they tested.
Yeah.
Right. So that went through the clinical trial process. It was shown to be safe and effective. Importantly, in the clinical trials, it was shown to be effective against essentially testing positive. And going back to effective communication, that was not effectively communicated. That's what that effectiveness was reflecting. Yeah. And we know, immunologists know, that immune systems contract. No matter what immune response you have, you're going to have an upward curve of antibodies, and then those antibodies are going to contract because your immune cells can't maintain that level of antibodies for super long. It wants to conserve energy. But what you're left with is that immune memory of B cells and T cells that are able to mount an effective immune response when you next encounter the pathogen, so that you can clear it and prevent severe disease. And that's what 2 to 3 doses leaves us with, right? So this response, this kind of reactionary response that I think nations like Israel are having to rising caseloads is not the right approach. We have to say at some point, what's our goal? Is our goal with this pandemic to prevent positive PCR tests? That's a really high bar for vaccines. You're probably not going to get that, especially not with a mucosal virus like SARS-CoV-2. If our goal is preventing people from going to the hospital and dying and getting severely ill, I think we have the tools for that. We have vaccines that do that. So it's a question of policy right now, what our goal is, and it should be preventing severe disease, because, really, if we go, for example, in the US, from 3,000 to 4,000 people dying every single day to a situation where everyone's vaccinated, and instead of 3,000 to 4,000 people dying a day, we have 3,000 to 4,000 people dying in a year, that's a lot better. That's not a pandemic, right? Yeah. So that's what we should be thinking about when we think about these vaccines. We shouldn't be thinking about, am I going to test positive? We should be thinking about, am I going to get really sick?
And once we get things back down to those levels, which were, similar to what we had before the pandemic, as you said, the pandemic's gone away, and then we can go back to normal. So if we move into specific points of misinformation, what do you, and this is very difficult because obviously there's a hell of a lot out there. It's kind of like a hydra. Once you chop off, 5 heads, another 15 come out at the same time. But what do you think are some of the most dangerous sort of myths that are out there at the moment regarding this pandemic? There's obviously a lot around vaccines, ivermectin, other treatments, things like this. What do you think are, maybe if you give me top sort of 3 or 5 of what you think are the biggest points of misinformation that are out there at the moment, and why they're so pernicious?
Yeah, it's, one of the first things that come to mind is this idea that vaccines are somehow dangerous for pregnant mothers. That idea, it's actually an old idea that has come around in almost every anti-vaccine campaign, that pregnant women are people who shouldn't be vaccinated. And that strikes a chord with an
Mm.
emotional chord with a lot
Yeah.
of people. They say, oh, well,
Yeah.
you know,
If you're
there's this
talking
life
about
changing.
women and children, it's a social
Right,
the
right,
social feeling of you want to protect those vulnerable groups, I guess.
right. And there was that idea pushed by Mike Yadon that vaccinating against COVID will somehow produce an immune response that will destroy the placenta, even though if you believe that, then COVID infections should do the exact same thing.
Yeah.
It never made any sense, but it caught on
Yeah.
really, really well. And I don't know how many pregnant women might have, and their unborn babies might have uh, been spared a lot of suffering if that idea wasn't so never became so widespread. But that's one thing that I think of right away.
Yeah.
Um, and kind of piggybacking off of that, this idea that children don't need COVID
Yes.
vaccines
Yes.
also is really pernicious because you know there there are kernels of truth, like most conspiracy theories. There are kernels of truth in that yes, children are less vulnerable to COVID um, than adults are and older people, but that doesn't mean they're perfectly protected.
Yeah.
And the more COVID spreads among children, the more risk they're going to have. And it's not just death we're talking about. We're talking about hospitalization. We're talking about multi-system inflammatory syndrome. We're talking about long COVID.
Mm.
These things are all very real. And on top of that, you have the fact that children can and do spread the virus. And we already have, I think the number is over 170,000 children in the US alone who have lost a primary or secondary caregiver to COVID. So, if they aren't vaccinated, they're not taking precautions, they have a higher risk of being infected and then transmitting the virus. They can bring it home,
Yeah.
infect their parents, which in lower income communities is more dangerous because in lower income communities, you're more likely to have grandparents living with you,
Mm.
things like that. So there's so much damage that um, come with that really emotional
Yeah.
argument that pregnant women and children shouldn't be vaccinated.
Yeah.
Um,
And,
yeah,
and,
it's
and
hard to
pick,
pick. It's hard to pick a top five, but
well,
those are the top two that I think of right
well,
away.
well, piggybacking on top of that, I'd like to kind of put a nice hat on that. The sort of, I guess what you're talking about there is the idea that the vaccines are incredibly dangerous. You see
Yes.
people like Robert Malone saying vaccines are killing more people than COVID does, for example. That would sort of be the hat that this goes under. I see people pointing to various sports stars dying of heart attacks and then trying to make the connection that this was due to the vaccine. And I think the big hat that this goes under, and you've done an excellent video on this, is this idea of the vaccine acquired what is it, the VAERS. I forget
Oh,
exactly what the letters stand for.
vaccine adverse event reporting system.
That's right. So could you explain to people, because I constantly see, this is one of the points of misinformation that I see, or one of the talking points that I see, is somebody will present one of these terrible Excel graphs that show nothing in VAERS bin, nothing in VAERS bin, nothing in VAERS bin. Pandemic starts, huge bar on Instagram. I'm
Yep.
like, I immediately can tell this is a terrible graph. But why should people not be so concerned when we see these increases in VAERS reports? Because you get people like Brett Weinstein saying there's a definite signal here, we have a huge problem, it's all
Yeah.
being covered up. And these people have cut through with a lot of people. Why should people not be so concerned when we hear about these vaccine adverse events?
Yeah. So what people need to understand is that VAERS is a passive reporting system. So any event, any health event that is picked up by a doctor or simply reported by any patient following a vaccine is going to show up in that database. So if I get vaccinated and then the next day I get a headache, that goes in VAERS. That comes up as an adverse event. If I get vaccinated and then the next day I break my leg, that comes up as that could come up as VAERS, as a VAERS event. And also real events can be reported there too. But what happens is uh, epidemiologists, experts will sift through this data and monitor it. and there are separate programs specifically for that, such as VSafe in the US, and PRISM. My wife actually got called by VSafe, um, so she got vaccinated while she was pregnant, and VSafe followed up with her, asking about how her experience was, which was fine. We had no issues, and we have a healthy baby now. But they actually do the work to.
Congratulations, by the way.
Thank you. But there are people who actually do the work to follow up on these things and find out, okay, this person says that they got vaccinated, and then the next day um, they apparently had a heart attack. Well, okay, what happened? What really happened? They might find that nothing happened, that it was a false event. They might find that it was a real event that was unrelated to the vaccine, or they might find that it deserves further investigation. And so that's what people see when they go to VAERS. They see that big number of adverse events increasing because we have millions.
These are kind of hypothesized cases that require
Yes.
further investigation, but not actually the filtered number that are left after those investigations have taken place.
Right. It's completely a hypothesis generating system. It's not meant to make conclusions. It's not meant to be analyzed at face value. And the reason that you see that big jump that people like Brett Weinstein will show is obviously because now hundreds of millions of people are getting vaccinated all at once.
Yeah.
So if you think of the normal health events that happen every day, how many people will go to the emergency room for whatever reason and have health events. Now, everybody's getting vaccinated all at once.
Yeah.
A lot of those health events are going to coincide with a vaccination. So they're going to show up in VAERS.
You're forcing them into one time bin.
Right. So programs like VSafe and PRISM, they go through and actually verify this stuff. And you can have confidence in this system because they were able to identify back in April, they identified 6 cases of that rare blood clotting situation when 6 million doses of the J&J shot had been given. That's, that's 1 in a million. That's very, very rare. And this system caught it. And they took action. They said, okay, we're seeing this concerning thing happen. Let's put a 2-week pause on the J&J vaccine. Let's see if these events continue or not. And let's try to learn more about it in the meantime so that we know what to do. And then 2 weeks later, they resumed it with more knowledge about what actually happens during that event.
It's actually a really interesting point that you make, that and really shows that you should have some trust in these reporting systems, because a lot of people at the time, I remember the AstraZeneca was paused in the EU or in the UK. I think it might have been both, because of rare blood clots. You talk about J&J as well. A lot of people at the time were saying it was kind of irresponsible, given the very low level of those incidences, to not continue rolling out this vaccine, given that we're in a pandemic. So if anything, they seem to be very much on the overcautious side with when looking for these signals. As you said, with giving out vaccines to children, I don't believe in the UK there's a very kind of deep discussion about giving them to under 16-year-olds and very young children. I believe that authorization has only been given recently in the US, if I'm correct, for very young children. Is that right?
Yeah, it's been a few months, I think, since 5 to 11, or no, it was 12 to 18 adolescents who were approved a few months ago, and 5 to 11 was more recent. Yeah.
But these decisions aren't taken in a very kamikaze fashion. They're taken in a very kind of slow, precautionary sense. So that gives you some confidence that they're not simply rushing ahead. Did you have a comment on?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say that's exactly right. And that runs counter to what all those people who are like Malone and Weinstein who are saying, that there are all of these adverse events that are going unnoticed, and no one wants to talk about vaccine adverse events when they're talked about all the time. They're discussed in meetings regularly, and decisions are made based on what the data show. So this idea that you can pick up a one in a million event and pause an entire vaccine program for 2 weeks, but totally ignore supposedly some people claim hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of deaths from vaccines. I mean, that's just there's no way that
Yeah.
that's happening.
It
But
makes no sense given what we've seen.
yeah,
The other big thing I see on vaccines before we move into sort of talking about why this has so much cut through is I see that these are experimental vaccines. We can't tell what's going to happen in 10 years, in 15 years, in 50 years, and that the vaccine manufacturers don't have any liability for this. So essentially, we're kind of flying blind and hoping that this is going to be a good solution in the long term. How would you respond to people who say that? Because to me, it kind of smacks of kind of scientific nihilism. You're saying I can't have a perfect idea going forward, so let's not do anything. Whereas you can't look at things in a vacuum. You have to look at the fact that we're in a pandemic right now and weigh those things up. How would you respond to people who say we can't know these vaccines are not going to have any adverse effects going forward?
yeah. So, so to people who say that the vaccines are experimental, I usually would just ask them, well, what experiment do you think hasn't been done that you want to see done?
Yeah,
And usually the answer, if they have one, is something like, well, we have to wait
yeah,
X number of years.
yeah,
And that's just not true. That's not how vaccine research works, because people will usually cite the numbers of, oh, it takes 10 years to approve a vaccine.
yeah,
Well, the real number is closer to 30, and the reason for that is because that number includes from start to finish, like from
yeah,
discovery stage of like, okay, we have this pathogen and we are trying to design a vaccine against it. And now let's do all this research to figure out how we do that. And then, oh, we think we have something that might work. Let's
yeah,
test it in animals. And then let's move on to humans. Let's move on to larger scale trials. That number, that 30-year number, includes all of that research. And that
yeah,
takes a ton of time. Uh, Luckily for COVID vaccines, a lot of that basic research was done beforehand because people had done a lot of work on SARS-1. People had done a lot of work on uh, mRNA vaccines over the course of several decades. So by the time SARS-CoV-2 came around, we already had a product that um, we could test within a few months.
yeah,
And so then it was just a matter of getting it into clinical trials. And that part was able to be sped up because normally the big roadblock is money
yeah,
in these clinical trials. Normally, what a company or a lab would have to do is they have to do the preclinical trials. That's the trials in animals. And then they have to collect that data, submit it to the FDA. The FDA has to review it, approve it, and then they move on to preclinical trials. And then, so after they get approved for preclinical trials, they have to do the fundraising for the
yeah,
human clinical trials and set all that up, and then repeat the whole process for phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. It takes a very, very long
yeah,
time.
yeah,
But in this case, we were able to do it really fast because all the money was taken care of, all the money was guaranteed. They had companies that already committed to the whole process. The FDA put them right in front of their queue, like
yeah,
number one, right when they received that data, they reviewed it
yeah,
because it was an emergency.
yeah,
So that's why we're able to get it out so fast. Um, but when people are still concerned about long-term effects, I tell them that you know no vaccine really has shown to be causing adverse events years after it's administered. Almost every single vaccine adverse event that has ever been attributed to a vaccine occurs within 8 weeks of the dose being given. And the reason for that is the adverse events are usually caused by, your immune system reacting, your immune system's initial reaction to the vaccine. Um, and that initial reaction doesn't last years. Like we said, we have that rise in antibodies, and then it contracts. You're just left with this immune memory. Um, so there's really no mechanistic reason in biology why, if I get a vaccine now, I might somehow get some disease from it years later.
Yeah.
Because all the contents of the vaccine are gone, the immune system has responded. You just have immune memory now, and immune memory doesn't turn into something else later.
It's almost like vaccine kind of homeopathy. It would have to sort of remember that it had a vaccine and that has some sort of interaction later on. It makes no sense if there's no sort of molecule left over to do something, to take
Mm-hmm.
an action.
Yeah, and the other question I have to ask those people is just, when do we know enough? Like, when would you know enough
Yeah.
to say, okay, I'm ready to get this vaccine? Like, what would you need to see? I try to get them to put a stake in the ground, so to speak, to say, like, yes, I've thought about it. This is what I need to see, and I'm not going to get vaccinated until I see that, because normally they don't have anything like that. Normally it's just these vague
Yeah.
fears
Yeah.
because they don't understand what already has been done.
And I guess it's wrong to look at those potential fears in a vacuum as well, right? Because we know, or we have seen some of the longer lingering term effects of COVID infections, talking about things like long COVID,
Hmm.
long-term debilitation from following COVID infections. So we have some ideas of what the longer-term effects of COVID might be. So it's not right to simply see things in a vacuum as well when we're looking at longer-term impacts.
Right. Yeah, there's definitely long-term effects from COVID infection. There's We haven't really seen any evidence of long COVID symptoms in vaccinated people. So, but if that were to happen, you would expect it to occur within like 2 months, again, within like 8 weeks of the dose being given, not years down the road.
Makes sense. So I wanted to change slightly just before because I want to talk about some specific characters as well, which is always fun, and I'll get people jumping a little bit. But
Yeah.
why do you think a lot of these ideas? So we've talked about people have a little bit of a distrust with institutions. Why do you think so many of these ideas that we've discussed and can be kind of debunked relatively quickly, or have good explanations for most of them? Why do you think they have so much cut through with huge groups of people in both the US and the UK and other countries? Why are they so powerful in the modern day when we know so much about virology? We've learned so much about this virus. Why are we still having to debunk these kind of arguments, which, as you say, seem to be recycled and regenerated
Hmm.
anytime there's a new virus, anytime there's a new vaccine?
Yeah, I just have to think of it in a historical context, and compare it to HIV/AIDS, where there at that point there was a ton of misinformation, a ton of misunderstanding of what the virus is and what it does, and um, some historians have attributed that to the fact that HIV/AIDS touched on so many personal aspects of life,
Yeah.
like sexuality, drug use,
Mm.
race was an issue. People thought at one point only black people could get it because a lot of Haitians were coming down with AIDS.
I
Um,
remember there was a stigma about homosexual people as well. Maybe spreading the
oh yeah,
virus is a kind of trope with HIV as well.
yeah. First it was only gay people could get it. Then it was only gay or black people could get it. Then it was only then drug users were added to that group. Um, it was always an other, but um, you know, it touched on so many personal aspects of society, and that's why I think people were so resistant to this idea that people didn't want to discuss it. It was almost taboo. So all this misinformation kind of filled those gaps. And now with COVID, we have a lot of the same characteristics, except in a different way. COVID is touching on freedom,
Yeah.
personal liberties, our own health, um, what it means to wearing a mask, personal interaction, all that stuff comes into it, and it can be very touchy for people. So they can get very emotionally charged and very uncomfortable. But then this misinformation comes in with this neat
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
tidy picture
Yeah.
of, oh, actually, you don't have to worry about any of that. Actually, it's not dangerous. Actually, it doesn't even exist.
Clarity in
And
an uncertain time and with a very difficult topic is something that's very attractive to people. A very simple solution to a complex problem, I guess.
definitely, yeah, people are. It's comforting to accept those ideas instead of the complicated reality that there is a deadly virus spreading very quickly through our population, and we have to change aspects of our lives to deal with it. Um, so I think that's why a lot of the misinformation is very attractive to people, and why it catches on so well.
And I think there's a couple of other ideas I had, and I just wanted to get your kind of ideas on them.
Hmm.
Is that because this is, as you say, it's something that impacts on everyday life. People feel like they should have an idea about it. People feel like they should have an opinion on it, and everyone does deserve to have an opinion on it. But a lot of people don't have necessarily the expert skills to have an opinion. So it's nice to get that sort of potted answer from someone.
Hmm.
And within that, things get so politicized. So you talk about freedom. It becomes immediately for some reason a left right issue. If
Yeah,
somebody's going to say something on this side, I'm going to disagree out of principle on this side. If
yeah,
somebody's going to say this
yeah.
over here, I'm going to disagree more or less out of principle. And almost the argument goes away from the virus onto kind of side political issues, which is what I see happening a lot. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, for sure. The politicization is just so sad. um, and it's tough because both administrations, the Trump administration and the Biden administration in the U.S., have been guilty of just trying to, like, they don't really care about the science. They care about saving face and looking good.
Yeah,
And I think that comes before honesty
yeah.
in for a lot of politicians. And
It's
in order
about
to
it's
look
about
good,
point scoring against the other side ahead of
exactly,
yeah.
exactly, in order to look good, they have to appeal to their base. And so they have to pick a side right at the beginning, and then they're stuck in it, and they just the science gets lost.
Yeah.
Um,
I think that's very fair. The one other thing I wanted to touch on, and we're both in this because we both make content that we put out on social media, we put out on YouTube. Is I
mhm,
think something that's new with this pandemic is the vast use of social media and the kind of media ecosystem that we have and the media incentives that we have at the moment. Sensationalism, we talked about it. Sensationalism, dunking, getting out there first, but not necessarily correctly.
mhm,
These are all things that aren't necessarily very, very well aligned with slow, methodical, thoughtful science, but
mhm.
which people really want to be on top of. So it incentivizes people to fill that gap and be, I've got my first, I'm there first, I'm going to discuss it first, but
Right,
incorrectly. I'm going to
right.
get there and fill a gap where people want to hear about things discussed in a certain way. Do you think the incentives that we have on social media and in the media are also a big problem of why we're so awash with misinformation?
Yeah, definitely. That the existence of the internet, as opposed to previous pandemics, and all these social media platforms definitely plays a huge role in, I think, the level of misinformation that we're seeing compared to previous pandemics. An important part of that, I think, is how easy it is to now monetize
Yeah,
content on
yeah,
the internet.
yeah,
I mean, that's Brett Weinstein's whole gig now. He just does content on the internet and that's how he makes his living, which is crazy to me. I mean, I like to do this as a hobby,
yeah,
but the idea of doing it as a full-time job just sounds way too stressful. But yeah, people jump in on that, and people get this kind of like clout chasing bug that I think a lot of normal internet influencers fall prey to. I mean, you see what kind of stuff internet influencers will do for views, for clout, and now you add this element of bringing science perspectives and news to people into that. It's it's easy to see how even they can fall victim to those same, irresponsible tactics to just gain more clout. We've seen that with a couple
That
spreaders of disinformation
this is
throughout the
this is a
pandemic.
really good segue,
Yeah.
because this is the
Yep.
last thing I want to come on to, because I don't want to keep you all day, but I do want to talk about a few specific characters. So over the last few months, we've seen various figures on Rogan. You mentioned Brett Weinstein. We've even seen John Campbell, who has over 2 million followers on YouTube, fact checked by the BBC yesterday for some of the things he said recently. If I was going to, and again, I know it's a very difficult question to ask, but if I was going to say, who are your sort of top 3 to 5? Who would you say are some of the big names that would be sort of top of that list and worry you most, and a lot of whom you've done excellent videos on?
Yeah, I thought I thought a lot about this, and I think I came up with a list of 5 to 6 that I think are
Okay,
most harmful.
we don't have to go
Um,
through all of them, but if you give me that list, we can pick off your top 3 maybe.
yeah, I think that RFK Jr., Robert F. Kennedy Jr., is a big problem because w one thing I was thinking about when making this list is that anti-vaxxers, the community has kind of always been very well organized. Um,
They're
they've
they're
had
a
a lot,
single issue voting block almost, aren't they? It's just one single issue and that's it. But there are a hell of a lot of them in the US specifically.
right? The community has a lot of wealthy and influential figures like Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who can recruit celebrities and, you know, spend all this money on advertising and reach these very vulnerable groups of people,
Mm,
like he did with Samoa
mm.
back in uh, back in the last decade, which caused a large measles outbreak in Samoa.
And
But
again, the
yeah,
point to make here is that this is a character who's been doing this with various vaccines, with various viruses. He
oh
just
yeah,
recycles himself over and over again, and yet the spell seems to work every single time, even though the failure of his rhetoric and the points he was making just seems to get memory hold, and off he goes again with the same types of arguments.
yeah, it just keeps working, so he keeps doing it. um, well, yeah, he's a big one. Joe Rogan, I think I've recently, just in the past like month or two, decided to add him on that list because he is bringing figures like Malone and McCullough to such a wide audience,
Now,
and
now
he's
people
just
now people
yeah.
will argue with this,
Hmm.
that and I can already hear people screaming in the background. And,
Hmm.
and the reason I agree with you on this is because he has such massive reach. And I think to bring people like that on, he knows that they have been discredited by many, many experts already. This is not someone has a new idea, let's bring them on. This is marketplace of ideas, let's have a debate. Here's somebody on who is on the other side of the debate, let's talk about it. This
Hmm.
is someone that he knows has been disgraced, someone he knows has been ripped apart in the media by experts, and yet he's like, let's just bring it on for this fake idea of that it's free speech and people are being silenced. I
Right.
don't see it as a free speech issue. I see it as, I'm bringing on a kook because it's the other side of the argument and it will entertain people or play to their priors. And I don't think it's a very responsible thing that he's doing that. I don't know how you feel about that.
No, yeah. I mean, it's not responsible journalism, I think you could call it. Like when you have that big of an audience, you have a responsibility to put out good information. And it's not good enough to just talk out both ends of your mouth where he does this thing where during his episodes he'll exude this certainty, especially around topics like COVID and vaccination.
Yeah.
He considers himself well informed, and he has experts, fake experts on who will reinforce the misinterpretations that he has. But then sometimes he's like, "Oh, I'm a big dummy. I don't know anything."
Yes.
Like, but it doesn't work. His
No.
followers repeat the things he says. They repeat the things that his guests say.
And you see this playing both sides actually, because you see if he says something that's relatively dangerous. Oh, it's just entertainment. It's just,
Mm-hmm.
don't take him seriously. He's a big dummy UFC guy. Look, he had Alex Jones on. Ha ha ha. Like, it's obviously just, it's WrestleMania. Like, why are you taking it so seriously? But then on the other side, when someone like Malone comes on and starts saying things that they like about vaccines and how dangerous they are, suddenly, look, he's giving a platform to an expert. He's a truth seeker. He's exactly what we need to save Western civilization.
Right.
So which one is it? If it's WrestleMania entertainment, okay, I kind of get that.
Right.
I've seen the Alex Jones episode. I thought it was intriguing and entertaining on one level. I like to watch conspiracy documentaries sometimes and think, Jesus, some people believe this. I get that. But people talk about it in different ways, and he must know that.
Oh yeah. I think he knows that, and I think he genuinely believes that he's putting out the correct information when it comes to COVID, and he's just not. And so, and he keeps doubling down.
Do you think it's a sincere belief that when people like Brett Weinstein or Robert Malone or whatever talk to him, that they're telling the truth, or do you think it's just clicks and money and playing this free speech angle? Which one do you think it is?
It's really hard to know what's going through his mind.
Probably an unfair question to say, can you mind read Joe Rogan? Sorry, that was probably a bit of a leading question.
But I think we can like point things out, like the fact that, as far as we know, he hasn't actually been vaccinated. That's a real world action that I think reflects one of his actual beliefs, that he doesn't need to get vaccinated because he thinks that his natural immunity is the best thing on the earth, and that the vaccines aren't very safe, both of which are very, very wrong ideas.
You're like 21 years old, and you say to me, should I get vaccinated? I go, no.
Actions speak louder than words.
Yeah.
To sum that
so I think that reflects a genuine belief that he has. And it's a little harder, I think, to listen to some of his episodes and reconcile that, because he has had experts like Peter Hotez on his podcast. And I believe in that conversation, Peter Hotez walked him through a lot of things concerning COVID and vaccines. And it was either in that episode or one of the other episodes where he had someone like Peter Hotez on, where he said, I might get vaccinated now. But then a few weeks later, he has someone like McCullough on, and it's a complete 180. It's like that never happened. So it's very strange behavior where it's like he genuinely believes that he shouldn't get vaccinated and all that, but he tries to seem sensible by having people like Peter Hotez on. It gets very strange.
Yeah. No, I think that's fair, because people will say, look, he had these two people on, so it's fair enough. But the problem is, it allows people to just not necessarily focus on the facts, but just run to their own priors, whichever side they're on, which isn't necessarily particularly useful. Okay, let's park Joe Rogan. You got some more on your list there?
Yes, yeah. Next, I kind of lump Malone and McCullough into one,
which they would hate, by the way, because they both seem incredibly narcissistic. But okay, so tell me what's.
Oh, you're right.
Tell me what's going on there. Well, we see, don't we, with the Malone thing. I don't doubt that he has skills in the area, and he had some contribution towards the mRNA vaccine sort of platform, but he likes to go off and kind of overplay his role in the research. So why do you think those two get rolled into one, and why do you think they're so pernicious?
Well, they're kind of a duo, right? They work together a lot. Like I said, the anti-vaccine community is very organized, and it's
like a terrible cop duo, isn't it? Malone and McCullough.
Yes. Make a terrible NBC show about that. Yeah. But they both have a lot of the same core goals, which is to discredit vaccines, to push the idea that early treatment is best, and that their early treatment protocols are best. And also to completely discredit medical and scientific bodies. So that's what I think they do together, and that's why I kind of lump them into one as one of my top five for the.
What are some of the main
worst.
arguments they've been making? Because I've seen with Malone ideas that the vaccines are killing sort of more people than COVID is. Spike protein is toxic. All these kind of things. We talked about women's reproductive health, myocarditis in young people. He seems to just really be a kind of laundry list of all the main sort of talking points that we've already discussed.
He really is. He goes down a laundry list, and one of the things that really surprised me the most when I listened to his interview on Rogan was when Rogan asked him, so if I go to the hospital and I was shot and I test positive for COVID,
yes,
and I die from my gunshot wound, that'll be a COVID death. And Malone's like, yes, absolutely. And that was like, wow, he really he really reached deep into the rabbit hole and pulled that out. Because
I think we're going to discuss this, by the way, when we get to John Campbell, because I think so maybe we should save this, but yes, it's really a really important something that I really took from his interview on Rogan as well was he very, very quickly went away from any idea of the science, and it very quickly went onto the politics to kind of scratch that partisanship. It started going off talking about Nazi Germany and how we were, going to be under the boot heel of authoritarianism imminently. It went off the rails very, very, very quickly. Let's just say that.
And that really is irritating to me. That people saying stuff like that will just, make me want to dunk on them and say something snarky, because it's so ignorant when you look at history. Just this idea that public health policies are going to lead to this authoritarian nightmare that you can compare to Nazi Germany. I mean, it's just so wackadoo.
Again, it's an emotional appeal more than anything, isn't it? Because
it's
almost, what's the worst thing you can think of? Hitler. Okay, it's like Nazi Germany.
Yeah.
Come on.
But it's like they clearly just don't know history. I mean, that's a big part of this. So for example, over 100 years ago in the US, when smallpox outbreaks were happening, we had a smallpox vaccine. And there was all this immigration coming into America. And there were public health efforts to control smallpox outbreaks. And there were a lot of complicated things like racism against immigrants coming into it. But really, a surprising thing that a lot of people might not know is that some of the public health policies were really extreme. Like, we're taking the racism out of it. There were literally squads of police and doctors who would, if there was a smallpox outbreak, they would go to that neighborhood, knock on doors, and forcibly vaccinate, which at that point was, for smallpox, they would scratch your arm with a lancet and put some lymph in the wound, and you would have a scar, and that would identify you as having been vaccinated against smallpox.
So really quite savage impositions on people that don't really match up with today's.
Yeah, and it was an extreme policy that nowadays would make us go like, whoa.
Yeah.
But it didn't lead to this authoritarian nightmare. It was all because it was all public health, right? And so to look at today and see less extreme policies where it's like, hey, please get vaccinated, or else, we might have to
not let you go to a rock concert.
We might have to not let you go to restaurants and movies and stuff. And people are like, my goodness, no, you're going to put me in a concentration camp next. And you're like, what? No, just please get vaccinated. It's a complete like amnesia of what it's been like in the past. So that's my soapbox about that.
No. This is your soapbox, so feel free. So any more on your list before we touch on one of a problem we've been having with a gentleman here in the UK.
Yeah. So, thinking about it this morning, I almost thought that Campbell might be making it into this list, but the last two I had written down,
He's the great UK hope for this list.
yeah.
He's,
Um, but the last two I had on this list were two individuals named Del Bigtree and Joseph Mercola.
yes, and I
Um,
gather they were part of this. What was this kind of freedom march on Washington or whatever there was the other day?
oh,
I didn't keep a great deal of tabs on it, but I saw
um,
some
I believe,
videos on the internet or on Twitter doing the rounds.
yeah, there was a rally in DC.
Hmm.
I'm pretty sure Del Bigtree was there.
Hmm.
I wouldn't be surprised if Mercola was there, but I don't know. Um, yeah, they are both. Del Bigtree's. I've called him on my channel my favorite anti-vaxxer just because he's like, he's. I mean, he's one of the
Favorite
reasons
in a very qualified sense, but like favorite
yeah.
to cover. Okay.
Yes. He's one of the reasons I started my channel because I thought like, what am I gonna do if I start a YouTube channel? And I thought Del Bigtree has a ton of content. He would be so fun
Yeah.
to cover.
Yeah.
Because he's like an Alex Jones figure. He does these ridiculous stunts and has these
You
very
would never have
impassionate
to go
rants.
to another well. You could just
Right.
constantly tap Big
Right.
Del.
Right. And I haven't covered him in a long time on my channel and I miss it, but he's a very prolific purveyor of anti-vaccine misinformation. He has his own show. He's had lots of guests. A lot of the anti-vaccine community tunes into his show. And same with Mercola. A lot of people read his anti-vaccine content. And he's been around for a while and was pegged by the Center for Countering Digital Hate as the most prolific spreader of anti-vaccine misinformation on social media. So, yeah.
It's a pretty strong list. That is.
Yeah,
Was that in any particular numbered order, or was that?
No particular order.
Right.
I don't know if I could rank them. It's
or
hard.
you want
It's
to?
hard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So some pretty strong characters on there. As we sort of come to the end of this, I really do want to cover, because obviously I'm UK based. Over the last day or so, there has been a lot of pushback against Dr. John Campbell. So John Campbell is what would be the right way to describe a very erudite figure.
Yeah.
Seems very persuasive, very softly spoken character over here in the UK. During the early stages of the pandemic, he got quite a lot of plaudits for explaining aspects of SARS-CoV-2 and the pandemic for lay people in a simplistic way. But over the last kind of few months, his kind of reach has exploded. I think he's got over 2.1 million subs on YouTube now, and his content seems to be becoming a little bit more credulous and conspiratorial, and a lot of people seem to think most of his content is reasonable, but then he just seems to go wackadoodle as you describe it on quite a few topics. And when you have 2.15 million subs or whatever he has, you really can't be doing that. And a few people, yourself, Susan Oliver, Greg Tucker Kellogg, they've been calling out some of his kind of slide into more conspiratorial topics. So do you maybe want to talk a little bit about what John Campbell's been doing and sort of the little bit of trouble he's got himself into recently, perhaps?
Yeah. So, I mean, he's a PhD in nursing education, which is a fantastic career. Don't want to take anything away from that, but I only say that just to make sure that people know that he's not a medical doctor or a research scientist, which some people might get that impression.
And there's a big problem there, isn't there? Just before you go into it, because he gives with the name and with the way that he speaks and the way that he presents himself, he gives a kind of visual presentation or an idea that he's deeply knowledgeable and deeply has deep expertise on a lot of the topics that he talks about, which might be a little bit of a false impression on some of the things he goes into.
Yeah, and I don't want to say that because he doesn't have a PhD in virology or immunology. Like he can't know anything about it.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. It can give a false sense of him being an expert where he is not.
Yeah.
And yeah, so he has a very successful YouTube channel, and I remember some people sent me one of his videos early on in the pandemic and asked me if I was going to cover him. And I said no at the time because I think I listened to like 10 minutes of the video, and I was like, he seems like fine.
Yeah.
I mean,
usually it's just underlining things from
Yeah.
articles that are already out there with the fountain pen. I honestly can't understand. And you know, anyone who gets to 2 million viewers, I guess that's an amazing accomplishment. I'm not jealous, but
Yeah.
I watch it and I'm just like, it's just an old guy underlining things that are on the BBC website with a fountain pen. I don't understand, but okay, fine. If people like
Yeah.
it, people like it. That's fine.
I know what you mean. I thought that was interesting too, the underlining and the check marking. That's like, okay, that's
It feels
fine.
very much like when we used to have overhead projectors at school, and the
Yeah.
teacher would sort of put it on. He's very old school, so
I
maybe
think that's what he's doing. Yeah.
there's some.
But yeah, I watched that video for the first time many months ago, and I thought, this guy's fine.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think that he's my go-to source for the pandemic,
Yeah.
but I'm like, I don't think he's
Doing
spreading
anything
too much
particular.
misinformation. So no, I'm not going to cover him. And then in the past few months, that changed. If you look at the analytics for his channel, he had two very large spikes in viewers and subscribers.
These will magically appear on the screen, by the way, when I do the editing. So.
Yeah, the first one was many months ago when SARS-CoV-2 was first coming out. He had a very large bump. And then from then on, he covered mostly COVID content.
Yeah.
So that tells you one thing, that he pays attention to what gets him views.
Yeah.
And then the second big bump that led to a very consistent rise in subscriptions and viewers was when he had a video about debunking the BBC about ivermectin.
Yeah.
And then very shortly after that, he had a guest on his channel who claimed to have been injured by a vaccine.
Yeah.
If
you just type in John Campbell on Google or whatever, you see, I put it in a little video, is you see vaccine injury, ivermectin, why theirs is wrong, this kind of thing.
Right.
And they're very much of a style over the last couple of months, which have been the biggest videos.
Yes, exactly. And like you said, it's all been in the past few months, and it started with those two videos I mentioned. And so that was really concerning. And I talked to Susan Oliver about this because she had appeared on his channel before. They had spoken. And I asked her,
this isn't just us, watching a couple of clips and saying this is a problem. This is a doctor who's appeared on his channel and is throwing up the same red flags that we are seeing from the outside.
Yeah. So like, I think it was over a month ago when I started thinking about making a video about him. I asked Susan Oliver, I said, what's the deal here? You were on his channel, you talked to him, like what's going on? And she basically told me that she would appear on his channel, talk about certain things. And then when he started this ivermectin rabbit hole, she started expressing concerns like, hey, that's not correct. I think you should correct this. And then he ghosted her. She said that he stopped responding. He doesn't talk to her anymore. And she hasn't appeared on his channel since then. And then she has gone on to make her own videos on her channel correcting a lot of his mistakes. So that was all very, very concerning to me, that he's cutting ties with peers who disagree with him. So he's kind of isolating himself, and he's leaning into the things that get him views, which is talking about how ivermectin is great and talking about how vaccines are questionable.
You can definitely see in a lot of the so I went. This is quite anecdotal, I accept. But if you go to some of the earlier videos, there's quite a lively discussion in the comments section. Whereas if you go to the ones over the last months or so, it's very much you know, you are amazing. Thank you for getting the truth out that
Oh,
we're
is
not
that right?
hearing, and all this kind of thing. So it's become very sort of one note in the comments. And
Mm,
one point on this, we'll talk about some of the specific problems. You say this idea of pushing back against, you know, that he's being censored or pushing back against the BBC. This was one of the things, the latest video he's put out. So he got fact checked yesterday, and we'll explain why that happened.
yeah.
But the video he put out today was, oh, BBC fact check me, blah 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 blah. Like,
Hmm.
there's very seems to be a very credulous audience that he's sort of pitching to, that wants to see that type of content. What do you think are the main sort of problems that he's been leaning into? Because you mentioned ivermectin, and I
Hmm.
remember a couple of months ago watching one of his videos, which was where he was extremely credulous about the idea that ivermectin in Japan had caused, quote unquote, the miracle in Japan, and basically destroyed cases, which is a nonsensical argument,
Yeah.
and doesn't stand up to any scrutiny whatsoever. And
No, it
then
doesn't.
I maybe you want to talk about a little bit about that first, and then we'll talk about the recent controversy.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the claim that ivermectin. So Japan had a large spike in cases that went down. It was a very sharp peak and very sharp decline. Um, Campbell attributed that to the use of ivermectin. And that kind of idea got sparked on the internet when a doctor, I can't remember his name, was at a press conference. This was in Japan,
Yeah,
and said that ivermectin might be useful. That's
yeah,
basically what he said.
yeah,
It might be useful. So then everybody thinks that Japan's using ivermectin.
yeah,
It's not true. This was one doctor saying, "Hey, maybe it works,"
yeah,
to a press conference.
yeah.
Um,
Doesn't say how many people started taking it. What were the protocols for taking it?
right.
That there's no of the just basic science of the numbers that you would need to know to do any sort of analysis as to whether there was a causation here rather than just a correlation.
Right. And if you look at Japan's public health websites and look at their COVID recommendations, they specifically say which medications they are using to treat COVID. And they include protocols, recommendations for vaccination, no ivermectin.
Yeah.
They don't recommend ivermectin at all.
Yeah.
So, there's just no evidence for it. And I know that one of the guys over at Decoding the Gurus podcast, he lives in Japan, and he has talked about this and said, hardly anyone knows about this. Hardly anyone knows about ivermectin in Japan. They're like, "What are you talking about? That's crazy." So for John Campbell to say that solved Japan's problem, that's just complete nonsense. I mean, it's very clear that Japan's COVID spike was solved by things they normally do. They're very good at enacting social distancing and masking behaviors. And they had a very large vaccine campaign that was also taking off just after that spike was really coming up. So it's clear that those precautions are what helped control the cases in Japan. So
And
there's nothing
presumably he hasn't gone back and corrected any of this, which is a real red flag as well. It seems to be red meat more for the sort of people who've come to watch recently.
Yeah, to my knowledge, he has not corrected himself on that. And that's really what concerned me about his video that he uploaded yesterday. He doubled down on what the BBC was calling him out on.
So do you want to tell us what that was? So there's, for those, it'll appear on the screen again, but he got fact checked yesterday by the BBC for some claims which are very, very out there, and you can the sort of interpretation, as he said, are pretty dark, to be honest. So do you want to say what the problem was here and what led people to kind of jump and feel like they had to do fact checks on one of his recent videos?
Yeah, so I included this in my video about him, and Susan Oliver and Greg Tucker Kellogg have also made videos about this. But in one of his videos recently, he was calling this what he was reporting a big revelation. And what this big revelation was that of the 150 or so thousand people in the UK who have died of COVID, only 17,000 died with COVID being the sole cause of death on their death certificate. And he was treating this like it's a really big story. His words were, "It's a huge story."
And this is a talking point that's taken off, hasn't it? Because in anti-vaccine communities, because they say, "Oh, look, really isn't a deadly virus. It's a scamdemic. Like only 17,000 people have really died. Flu's been rebranded. All these kind of nonsense ideas." And he's really lent into that here.
Yeah, that's what people are like. People in anti-vaccine and COVID denying circles, they're sharing his video, saying exactly that. And it's not. They're not really misinterpreting what he's saying either. He says in his video, "Oh, look at this. Only 17,000 people have died of COVID alone." And that tells us that he says something along the lines of, it shows us that COVID's a lot less deadly than the media has been intimating. That is a huge conspiracy. Theorists hear that and they're like, boom, I'm on board.
And this is a big problem, isn't it? Because he lends, when you have that many followers and you have that sort of, you have the sort of moniker of doctor there, it offers a sort of reasonable face to a lot of those conspiracy theories. When you have someone like that, basically saying the same thing in a more measured fashion, in a lot of ways, it's more dangerous than an Alex Jones screaming and saying the frogs are turning gay and then throwing that in with all the rest. When it's from someone who's seems a lot more considered and has been in the past a lot more considered, it's incredibly dangerous, and it can be used to kind of launder a lot of these bad conspiratorial ideas.
I agree that it does make him a little more dangerous, which is why I was considering putting him on my top 5 this morning. Because you're right. When Alex Jones says something, there's going to be a group of people who already believe Alex Jones. They're going to be like, yes, of course. Of course the frogs are turned gay by sunlight. I don't know. And then there's going to be the rest of the population who's like, Alex Jones is insane. But if someone like John Campbell, who has been doing, reasonable COVID journalism for most of the pandemic, has suddenly done a 180 and is now saying all these things, it might make reasonable people think twice, which is really bad, because what he's being fact checked on for the BBC is just so bad. I mean,
do you want to explain why this is such a flawed analysis? Why is the 17,000 death certificates that only say COVID is the sole cause of death? Why is that not a good? Why is him saying that makes COVID far less deadly such a terrible assessment of the evidence there?
Yeah. So first of all, I want to say that he still maintains, even in his video that he uploaded yesterday, that this is a big story, and it's just not. I have a video on my channel. I don't remember what the name of it is, but I uploaded it in 2020 because this idea was around back then when there was some big
it's the dying with COVID and not of COVID sort of line of argumentation, isn't it?
Yeah, it was the exact same story where CDC figures came out saying that 6,000 people have died of COVID with only COVID as the cause of death on the death certificate. But what people don't understand, and why John Campbell shouldn't be reporting this as a big story at all, and why he's completely misinterpreting it, is because when someone dies in the hospital of any disease, there's not going to be just one thing on the death certificate. I mean, very unlikely that there's going to be one thing there, because people will come in with COVID, for example, and then 5 days later they'll develop pneumonia, and then a few days later they'll eventually pass away from a respiratory arrest or organ failure or something like that. And all of those things get put on the death certificate. So it'll say like, this patient died of respiratory arrest. as a result of pneumonia,
Yeah.
as a result of COVID,
Yeah.
right? So
So to
all of the,
arbitrarily just say, show me all the death certificates that just have COVID on it, is a very, well, it's exactly that. It's a very arbitrary filter to put on to death
yeah,
certificates.
it doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
It's I mean, what probably happened in those numbers where people only had COVID on their death certificate, probably what happened is the patient died at home,
Yeah.
and the physician who filled out the death certificate obviously wasn't there to record any
Ongoing
co-occurring,
symptoms. Yeah.
any comorbidities, any co-occurring events. So they didn't know if the patient had pneumonia or what exactly they died from. And they probably didn't get an autopsy because autopsies are had to be asked for by the family or approved by the family. And but the doctor knew that the patient had been sent home with COVID. So from the doctor's best judgment and all of their medical expertise, they put COVID-19 on the death certificate, and that's it.
And there's another kind of immoral side to this, isn't there? Because if you're saying somebody who has asthma, for example, dies of COVID, they still died of COVID because they wouldn't have died if COVID hadn't been around. They, maybe they couldn't run as fast as somebody else because they had an asthma attack and blah, blah, blah. But they still would have had a fully functional, enjoyable life were
Yeah.
it not for COVID. So the idea that their death is sort of less impactful is it's just a very, I don't want to be too harsh, but it's a very dark interpretation of what's going on.
Yeah, and John tries to address that in his most recent video about this. He says like, "Oh, I want to make it clear that those with diabetes could have still lived many more years," and he tells a story of how he still remembers his first patients that died, and he's appealing to emotions, but he's not really addressing the core issue of what was wrong with his original video. He's not saying, "Oh, I was wrong. This wasn't a big story. That 17,000 number doesn't mean what I was saying it means," which is, again, and I quote, that COVID is not as deadly as the COVID death numbers aren't as high as the media has been intimating. I mean, he said that, and he hasn't addressed it. He hasn't, corrected himself in this new video. He definitely is doubling down, and it's really concerning for me to see.
So to make a kind of firm sort of analogy for people out there, just to make it crystal clear, if somebody came in with a gunshot wound, for example, into an A&E, and it would be, but they had asthma, for example, and asthma was put on the death certificate. Nobody would say that it wasn't or they had let's say they had make it a little bit more concrete. They had a blood clotting disorder, and they bled out, for example. That would be a much better example. It would be like saying that the gunshot wound or the person who shot them wasn't responsible for that death because they had a blood clotting disorder. It's clearly a nonsense argument. It doesn't really mean anything. The person would have been going about their life quite happily were it not for the fact that they got shot. So it's a very weak, almost meaningless interpretation of the data.
Yeah, and he's really, but he doesn't address any of that, and he's really still trying to appeal to this idea that if you're young and healthy, that you don't have anything to worry about with COVID, because he's like, he's addressing the diabetes thing, but that's not really the point. That's he's not addressing what the average COVID death certificate is going to look like, which is including all these things that are caused by COVID once you actually get sick with it. And, that's the real problem, that he's reinforcing that idea that young and healthy don't need to worry. It's just totally not true. You cannot predict how well you're going to do with COVID. Young people can suffer from it. They can die. They can pass it on to someone. I mean, it's really irresponsible journalism that he's doing right now. And
as you say, or as I think we would both say, when you have 2.1 million followers, there's a need to set a very, very high bar and to be very, very clear. So I want to wrap this up because I've kept you for a long time and I really, really appreciate you taking the time. Final question. So to your mind, We've seen that there's a hell of a lot of misinformation, out there. What can we do to improve the discourse on these complex topics, and how can we sort of protect ourselves and make sure we get the best information that we possibly can? What would be your tips to someone out there to get the best information on what's going on in this pandemic?
Well, I would say, my little soundbite, I guess, would be think before you speak. If you're going to engage with people, if you're going to write about stuff, talk about stuff pertaining to COVID, as if you know something about it, make sure you really do the work first to understand what the data are. And if you don't know, try to talk to people. I think
there's nothing wrong with not knowing.
Yeah, that can be said for anybody, even if you already know what the data say, talk to people. You're an asset to society, then talk to people and make sure that they're understanding the information. If you don't know, or if you're unsure, or if you've heard multiple things, you don't know what to believe, seek out more information, challenge your own ideas. Just really be earnest and honest, I think, in your pursuit of understanding this stuff and in your conversations with people. Don't trust politicians, please, for God's sakes. For God's sake, stop listening to politicians, stop reading headlines. That's not helping. You have to really try your best to go to the scientific sources and give it an honest read, give it an honest listen. There's so much to this, but that's what I can say right now.
I think those are very good points for not just for COVID, not just for the pandemic, but for life in general. So Dan, I want to wrap this up, and I want to thank you very, very much for taking such a good amount of time this morning to go through that all with us. Before we finish up, where would you like to send people to keep up with what you're saying, what you're doing, and everything Dan Wilson?
So you can find me on YouTube. My channel is DebunkDaFunk with Dr. Wilson. I am on Twitter at DebunkDaFunk, and I'm on Facebook. I think my Facebook page is Doc Wilson Debunks, and I'm on Instagram. But if you want to get in contact with me, email, Facebook, and Twitter are the best ways to do it.
Awesome. All the links will be down in the description. Why Debunk the Funk, very quickly?
So I asked, this was funny. I have friends who are in film. And when I was thinking about making my YouTube channel, I was trying to think of a name. And my first idea was PH Dan, as a play on PhD. And one of my friends was like, well, why not Debunk the Funk? I like that. And I'm like, that does sound nice. So it was his idea, and I liked it. And then, it kind of worked out where at the beginning of my channel, my hair was really short. I always kept it really short because I was always self-conscious about it. I never liked my hair to be poofy. But then the pandemic happened and I didn't get a haircut for several months. And so I'm like, I'll just pick it out. It kind of goes with the channel name.
Yeah.
And then I liked it and I just let it grow, and it kind of fits with like the, funk music reference, and I like it.
I love it. Dan, thank you so much again. I really, really appreciate you taking the time. I've learned so much about that. Give me a hell of a lot, and the viewers a hell of a lot to think about. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful weekend, and I'm sure we will talk again soon.
Yeah, we'll keep in touch, Sam. Thank you so much for having me.
It was a great pleasure. The pleasure was all mine. Thank you very much, buddy. I'll talk to you again soon.
All right, thanks.
Bye now. Bye.
Bye.
I want to know what you think, because you're the scholars of enlightenment that I do this for. So please take a moment, if you wish, to let me know down in the comment section. And if you like this video, please consider leaving a like, subscribing, setting up notifications, and sharing this video more widely. I can't tell you how much these simple actions help me out and how much I'd appreciate it. Thanks for watching. Thanks for being scientific. Thanks for being bad.